So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Canadian Physicians Pension Plan, which is the webinar about pensions. And tonight we're going to have Mr. Jean-Pierre Laporte introduce the topic, how use of pension law allows physicians to achieve superior retirement incomes. And we're going to be talking about pension plans and how it compares to RSP. So I want to introduce Mr. JP Laporte, who is the CEO of Integris Pension Management Corp. And also the treasurer of the Canadian Physicians Pension Plan. And I forgot to introduce myself. I am Vuket Tran. I'm a physician myself, and I am the president of the Canadian Physicians Pension Plan. And so those are our disclosures for tonight. So JP, I'm going to leave the floor to you, and how about you introduce yourself and then move along with the presentation.
Sure. So thanks, Vu. I'm a pension lawyer by training. I've been practicing for 24 years in this area of the law. And I have a lot of ideas about how Canadians should be using pension legislation to improve their retirement outcomes. So this is why these slides were put together. And tonight, the roadmap that we have is really two-prong. First, we're going to review using the Medicine Professional Corporation as a strategy to save for retirement, because that's what most people do. When they're practicing medicine and they've incorporated, they'll often use their corporation as if it was a pension plan. They'll also use an RRSP on the side. Sometimes they'll use insurance. Anyway, they'll use the corporation as the core mechanism to save for retirement. And then we're going to review the use of the Canadian Physicians Pension Plan as an alternative. So let's get right into it. And the question of the night is using your medical professional corporation, your MPC, to save a tax efficient strategy? What happens from a tax perspective when a physician uses their corporation as the primary way to save money for their retirement? Well, first of all, when the Ontario or other provincial payer reimburses or pays the medical corporation for the services of the physician, we're facing what's called active business tax at the corporate level. Right now in Ontario, on the first $500,000, it's 12.2%. So there's one layer of tax that is triggered. And then when the rest of the money that's not paid out in the form of a dividend or salary is invested by the medical corporation in what we call a non-registered corporate investment account, those dollars also attract tax. And because it's not active business anymore, it's passive, the tax rate is over 50%. It's 50.17% in Ontario, and similar across other provinces. So there's a second layer of tax. If the corporation generates more than $50,000 of passive investment income, then there's a third tax, which is called the tax on passive income. And what it does is that it makes the first tax that we were talking about, instead of being 12.2%, it makes it 26.5%. So it doubles the tax that the corporation has to pay on first dollar when it's being earned by the provincial payer, whether it's OHIP or whatever it is in the province of the physician. And then, if that wasn't bad enough, once the professional corporation decides to pay the physician a dividend in order for the physician to be able to spend the money, then there's personal tax on the dividend that has to be paid. So there's a fourth layer of tax. And then if the physician were to pass away suddenly, accident or otherwise, then there's a fifth tax, which is the deemed disposition tax that's applied to the shares of the professional corporation. So the estate of the physician is now facing a tax bill because the professional corporation had a value of 1 cent per share when the physician incorporated. And now that there's all this money built up, these millions of dollars of investments, then those shares now have value. So, from a tax perspective, the difference between the penny per share and the tens of thousands of dollars per share is now a capital gain, and the estate has to pay tax on that capital gain. And if the estate doesn't have the money, it may have to sell the sum of the assets of the company and create more tax. And if the physician doesn't die but decides to leave the country, wants to go to some tax haven or some other country where taxes are lower, then there is also what we call the departure tax, which is another deemed disposition, another automatic tax problem. If you also forgot to create a corporate will for yourself and the shares of your professional corporation end up in your regular will, then in many, many provinces, there's provincial probate fees, which is not even listed here, but that would be a seventh tax. So as you can see, using the medical corporation is not a tax efficient way to save for retirement. Because at least there's 6 potential tax leakages that are destroying the wealth that you're trying to accumulate for your retirement. And most people think that this is the only way to do it. I've already mentioned provincial probate if you don't have a separate will. So it's even worse than 6 potential tax. Could be 7 taxes. So the question then is, what about if I had used a pension plan instead of saving through the corporation? What happens from a tax perspective? Well, remember that first tax, the 12.2% tax that your corporation has to pay when it receives income from the provincial payer, from the customer? When you're contributing money to a pension plan, the corporation claims what's called an offsetting tax deduction. So that 12.2% is actually zero with us because you don't have to pay it. You're deferring that tax by claiming a deduction for whatever's contributed to the pension plan. And on the growth, instead of facing a 50.17% tax passive, any growth inside the pension plan faces a 0% tax because there's no tax on the returns inside of a tax-exempt pension plan. So the money is growing much faster because it's not constantly being eroded by this 50% tax rate. What about the tax on passive income if you exceed $50,000 of passive income? Well, in our case, we don't have to worry about that because the assets are not sitting on the balance sheet of the professional corporation. The assets are sitting in a special pension trust that was created when we set up the pension plan. So any passive income being generated inside the pension plan is not passive income of the company. It's considered off book. So we don't face this third tax that we were talking about earlier. If the physician has children that are on the payroll and decides, or not decides, and dies, instead of having a big tax bill, which is what we discussed earlier, here what happens is the money becomes surplus and stays inside the pension plan because it's necessary to pay the children, the survivors, a pension when they turn of age, when they become older. So instead of giving half the money to the government right away, we're keeping it sheltered from taxation inside the pension plan. And if the physician decides to leave the country and becomes a non-resident, there's no departure tax because under the law, the assets inside the pension plan are considered exempt assets for departure tax purposes. So there's zero tax on the capital once a physician decides to leave the country. So really begs the question, well, when do I pay tax? Well, you only pay tax when you're collecting your monthly pension in retirement. So that's a big difference from the other physician who was using the corporation as a form of pension plan. And so the next question that people ask me is they say, well, how bad is this single tax that the pension client faces when they're finally getting their pension? And the answer is actually a little complicated because it will depend on a bunch of factors. If you look at the bottom, a physician that's a non-resident and that's living in there's 100 different countries around the world that have tax treaties with Canada, most of the civilized places. Those tax treaties specify that the Canadian tax you have to pay on collecting your pension is 15% flat. So it doesn't matter if it's $100,000, $200,000, $500,000 a year, you're paying 15% to the government for that pension. Now, if you're not lucky enough to be in one of those 100 different countries and you move to a tax haven where there is no tax treaty in place, then there is tax. It's 25% as a non-resident. And then finally, if you stay in Canada and you are a resident, then the taxes will depend because it's graduated. And so if you have very little income, it could be in the 15% or even lower. And then if you have a lot of income, like hundreds of thousands of dollars of or more of taxable income, then you could be pushing up into the top bracket of 54%. So it will depend on a bunch of factors, including whether or not you have a spouse and whether you're able to do pension income splitting with your spouse in retirement. Now, I mentioned that we were looking at comparing using a pension plan versus using a corporation. But a lot of physicians have a corporation and they use the RRSP on the side. So the next question is, well, how does the pension plan stack up against using an RRSP? With an RRSP, and this is the light blue circle in the bottom right-hand corner, you get one annual deduction, your 18% of last year's earned income up to a limit. That's the only tax deduction you get with an RRSP. When you're using a pension plan, you got all the dark blue circles. So you got your past service, which is all the years that you were collecting a salary from your professional corporation. You have higher annual contributions because we exceed the 18%. We go all the way to almost 30% of salary being the annual limit. All the investment management fees are tax deductible, which they're not under an RSP. If your corporation borrows money to contribute, the interest becomes tax deductible. Again, not possible with an RSP. You have special payments, which are catch-up payments if the rate of return on the assets inside the pension plan is below 7.5%. We have the ability to contribute even more money, and all of those extra contributions are also tax deductible. In the first year, not only can you do all these other contributions we just talked about, you can also do an RSP contribution. It's called the RSP double dip. And then in subsequent years, you can do a small $600 per year. It's called a PA offset amount. That's a little gravy, some extra personal tax deductions in addition to everything else. And then finally, towards retirement, we can also enhance the basic pension promised by the pension plan and trigger what's called terminal funding. And terminal funding is yet another corporate tax deduction that's made available to your professional corporation. And this can be very large. It can be a couple $1 million. So you can see that when you're looking at the pension plan versus an RSP, it's not quite a fair fight because the pension plan has all of these extra rules that allows it to contribute so much more money than the RSP. And yet, 97% of physicians are using the RSP because they've never heard of pension plans. So I'm throwing a lot of terms at you, a lot of information, but really, let's step back for a second. What else does a pension plan do? Well, the way that I like to look at it or think about it is that this is a tax optimization problem. We're trying to minimize how much tax we're going to be paying up front, defer the payment of that tax through the pension plan so that we have a lot more money to live off in retirement. And really, when you're trying to solve a problem like this, you always have to have the appropriate tool in your hand. And the analogy that I keep bringing up is, if a surgeon is trying to do some heart surgery and they got to open up that chest, There are different kinds of tools you can use. I mean, you can use a scalpel, or technically you could use a butter knife, right? Both will eventually get the job done. But the reality is that one tool is a lot more elegant in the way it works than the other. And so the same thing is true when you're thinking about retirement. If you're using the RRSP or you're using the corporation, you're using a butter knife because it's not designed to maximize savings for retirement. One is fully taxable, the corporation, and the other, the RRSP, only has one single limited contribution amount each year. So they're not appropriate to maximize retirement income. So let's talk about the solution. So we've talked about using the corporation as a mechanism to save for retirement. We mentioned the RRSP and its flaws. So let's talk about what we're really here tonight to talk about, which is really the use of a registered pension plan. So the Canadian Physicians Pension Plan is really a federation of personal or individual pension plans that are banded together to create economies of scale and to create some market power. And at its core, this federation is based on a bunch of building blocks, which are the personal pension plans or individual pension plans. It doesn't matter. We offer both solutions. And for the purposes of tonight's presentation, they're really interchangeable. And really, the reason why I call them building block is because these pension plans that the professional corporation sets up comes or breaks down across three important dimensions. One being what I call enhanced contributions, and we've already talked about some of them. The other one are special deductions. We've already covered some of those. And finally, there's also unique tax optimization strategies. And some of these are also covered, but were also covered, but we're going to get into a little bit more detail. And I'm not going to get into these bullet points right now, but it's just to show that this is a very powerful tax optimizing tool that is the basis for joining the federation. The enhanced contributions are particularly important because when you're making use of all of these tax deductions, it's quite easy to triple, if not quadruple, the deductions that are otherwise available to someone using an RRSP over the same time frame. So the question is, should you be content with 1/3 or 1/4 of what someone with a pension plan is able to do? And I think the answer should be no. Should be if the law allows me to multiply my tax relief and pay less to the government up front, why wouldn't I use it? Right? This is really the open question. Because what we're trying to do by using these tax rules is we're building up what I call incremental layers of guaranteed value. Every time a rule allows us to minimize the amount of taxes we have to remit to the government, that's value that's guaranteed. That's money that didn't leave the bank account, that's staying in the ecosystem, and that's now being used to generate a pension over time. It doesn't depend on the stock market. It doesn't depend on accepting a high level of risk. It's risk-free. It's guaranteed value. And this is really the name of the game, is how can we be smart about using pension legislation to build up a bigger nest egg than other physicians or other professionals who are ignorant of the law, who don't know anything about pensions. And to show you how these strategies that, the third circle that I was mentioning when I was talking about the building blocks, how these strategies can create their own wealth. One example is the ability to pass wealth to family members upon death. Because if you don't use a pension plan, if you're using an RRSP or you're leaving the money in your corporation and you pass away, typically there's a spousal rollover. But if you don't have a spouse or you're divorced or you die in the same car accident as your spouse, that capital, all that money is now subject to tax. So you could lose, or the estate, the family could lose half the money right there on the spot. But when you have a pension plan, what it is you have one single communal pool of money, the pension fund, that's used to pay fixed defined benefit pensions. You know, you shall get X dollars per month or X dollars per year. That's your fixed pension. That's your defined pension. And that is financed out of the central pool of money. But when someone dies, that defined benefit pension typically ceases to be payable. So whatever money is left behind that hasn't been spent, hasn't been paid out yet, is reclassified as pension surplus. And under pension laws, the surplus money doesn't get taxed until it's paid out of the pension plan, either in the form of a survivor pension to survivors or as a distribution of surplus. So that's why I was saying earlier that should the physician pass away, the millions of dollars that are still sitting inside the pension plan doesn't get taxed if there are still other members of the plan, like children in the plan. And a lot of people say, well, how is that even possible? That seems too good to be true. It's possible because these pension laws that we're using are quite old and they actually apply to large defined benefit plans that you're familiar with, the ones that teachers participate in, or civil servants, or government workers, or utility workers, or steel workers. All of these large defined benefit plans are all built on the same principle. Everybody's guaranteed a pension, but if you pass away and there's no survivor, the rest of the money just stays in the pool. So other people will eventually enjoy your money. And likewise, you may enjoy the money of other people that died that didn't have any survivors. But this is not how we operate. We are bound by the same rule, except that here, in our case, the other survivors are not strangers. They're our own flesh and blood. They're our kids. So we're able to pass this wealth to our loved ones because this is not a communal pool with all kinds of strangers. It's only for the physician and the spouse and maybe the children. So we're using the same law, but with a much better result. And the basic decision tree that the physician has, taxpayer has, is, you know, when I pass away, do I want 50% of my money to go to the CRA, or would I rather give it to my children? If you would rather give it to the CRA, then just stay in an RSP or stay in a corporate savings arrangement. Use your corporation. That's the path you're on. If you'd rather give it to your children, then you need to be in the right tool. You need to have the right solution, which is the pension plan. Again, the scalpel and the butter knife. Now, another tax optimization strategy that comes with these pensions is the concept of pension income splitting. So let's look at a quick example. Imagine that you've been contributing to your own pension plan for a few years, and now that you've decided to turn on the taps, you want to start collecting your pension. The annual pension that's promised to you happens to be 163,909. Could be 200, could be 300, could be 100. I just used this because I was running some numbers for an actual client one day. So I used this number. Now in Ontario, and I apologize for people that are outside of Ontario that have different tax rates, but roughly, if you were collecting just that, you'd be paying $52,000 in taxes. But if you split the 163,909 and you divide it up and you say, I want to transfer half of that to the tax return of my spouse, because my spouse is a stay-at-home spouse with no income, then what happens is both parties in the couple pay tax on half that income. So if you do that, if each person is declaring 81,954 of taxable income, which is half of the pension amount, then each person has to pay 17,324 because they're in a lower tax bracket. And the combined total tax for the household is 34,648. Well, that's a heck of a lot better than the 52,100. That's actually $17,452 saved that doesn't have to go to CRA every year, that the couple gets to hang on to. They're still collecting $163,909, but now they're only paying 17,000. They're only paying 34,648. So they're saving $17,000 in taxes just with this paper exercise. Now, I've been talking a lot about taxes, but pension plan is not just taxes, it's also investments. And the good news is that when it comes to investing the assets that are contributed to the pension plan, the solutions are even better with a pension plan than an RRSP, because the registered pension plans that we use, whether it's a PPP or an IPP, are not RRSPs. And therefore, they're governed by different sets of rules. And under these pension investment rules, the scope of possible investment is significantly greater, larger than under an RRSP. There are certain things that a pension plan is allowed to invest in that someone cannot do with their RRSP. So I always give the example, and this is why we have a little picture here, of the 407 toll highway, which is probably one of the most profitable companies in Ontario with the highest profit margin. Well, obviously, it's a monopoly. So if you want to use that highway, you're going to pay, and they don't wait long to collect your money. So the 407 toll highway is owned by a whole bunch of pension plans, because the little guys like us, the investors with their RRSPs or TFSAs, we don't qualify. We're not allowed at the table. But if you're a registered pension plan, then you have a possibility of being part of these types of asset classes like infrastructure, utilities, these sort of long-term, what we call cash cows, that are often highly regulated and either monopolies or oligopolistic in nature, which is why they're so profitable. Another spear investment solution that's possible under a pension plan is purchasing private real estate. And what's kind of neat is that the different pension plans that are part of the federation can band, and not just can, they do band together and purchase shares of tax-exempt pension real estate investment corporations. And what are these pension real estate corporations? They are tax-exempt entities. And they're tax-exempt because the law specifies that the only person that's entitled to purchase shares of such a company has to be a registered pension plan, like an IPP or a PPP, or maybe even a very large registered pension plan like the teacher's pension plan or the General Motors pension plan. Others, taxpayers, individuals, corporations, none of them are allowed to purchase shares of such a pension realty corporation. So let me show you a quick example. Imagine that we have a medical clinic with 4 physicians, John, Julie, Sunil, and Don. Of course, each physician has their own professional corporation. And so 3 of the 4 physicians love real estate. John is a bit of an odd duck. He doesn't believe in real estate. He likes GICs and stocks. So he's not going to participate. He has his pension plan, but he's just not going to join. But Julie, Sunil, and Don, they love private real estate. They like to touch the building. They like to talk to the tenant. They like to see the check being deposited. They like to show off and say, hey, I own this building. So what they can do is they can have their pension plans use some of their money and purchase shares of a pension realty corporation. Remember, that's a tax-exempt corporation. And in turn, that pension realty corporation can become the landlord of the private real estate and collect the rents without paying any taxes. In fact, if the landlord or the pension realty corporation decides to flip the building to a new purchaser, any capital gain any increase in the value is also tax-free because, as I said before, the Pension Realty Corporation is tax exempt. If the Pension Realty Corporation decides to repatriate some money back to its shareholders, the different pension plans, and declares dividends, those dividends are also tax exempt when they're received by the pension plans. So the pension plans don't pay tax when they receive the dividend. We've created a completely tax exempt loop where we can invest in real estate. And this is being done by a whole bunch of physicians that are part of the CPPP right now. Now, we have people who are always naysayers, people who always try to poke holes. And normally these slides have a number of objections, but tonight I've only got one here. And this is one that we hear all the time, which to me is silly, but it's important to deal with it. So a lot of accountants who counsel their physician clients, when they're asked by the physician, hey, should I set up an IPP or a PPP? And the answer that they often hear is, well, these are very expensive, and unless you commit to them and put a lot of money in them, the costs outweigh the benefits, so I wouldn't do it. So many physicians have been dissuaded from signing up based on this advice. What the accountant usually don't know is that under the CPPP, the costs, the so-called large costs, disappear after 3 years in any event if we have at least $500,000 of assets in the plan. So it's hard to say that a zero cost is expensive. But even if they did not disappear because we have enough assets, even if you only start with $50,000 in assets and therefore you can't have those costs disappear, the costs are already paid for by the additional tax refunds, the tax savings that the system allows. Remember, when I was telling you that we can triple or quadruple the tax deductions that an RSP gives you, well, what does that mean when you're able to put, $100,000 instead of $25,000? If you're claiming a $100,000 deduction, and let's say the corporation is taxed at 20%, well, that's $20,000 of tax refunds. That's going to cover the first 8 years of annual costs right there in the first year. So it means that the system auto-finances itself, even without the 3-year subsidy that makes the fees disappear once you have enough assets. And for people who are wondering, well, what do I mean by these tax refunds? Like, can you give me an example? So here we put some examples of what these refunds look like. So if someone is buying back 10, 15 years of past service, by the time the corporation claims its deductions, the refunds of the cash that CRA is refunding the company could be like $50,000. The fact that you can put more money every year than under an RSP over time, that could be another $70,000. The fact that you can write off all your investment management fees over time, especially as the assets grow, that advantage keeps getting larger every year. That could be another $40,000. If the company borrows money and writes off the interest, that could be another $5,000 of refunds. If the rate of return is below 7.5% and the corporation gets to write extra checks to the pension plan under special payments, that could be another $20,000. In the first year, if you're able to put $20,000 in your RSP and you're taxed at 50%, that could be a $10,000 refund. And terminal funding is the largest of all. And it's not inconceivable to get extremely large refunds at that point. So you can see that when you start adding up all of these refunds, they dwarf they almost make the fees completely disappear. But again, the accountant, either because they don't know these rules or they haven't mapped it out, they haven't costed it, they haven't done the math, will say, "Oh, don't do that. Just too expensive." So it's important to do the math, get an illustration, and guide your decision through facts and not sort of quick back of the napkin decisions. Now, what are some of the benefits of using a registered pension plan versus an RSP? Well, because of what I've said earlier, because we can claim many, many more tax deductions than under an RSP, assuming all else is equal, assuming the passage of time and assuming the same rate of return, the same level of risk selected, mathematically, the person using a pension plan will end up with a lot more money than someone using other solutions. So that's why it's important to use the right tool. That's why the butter knife should be left for spreading butter, and the scalpel is the better one for surgery. Now, to give you a quick illustration, imagine a 47-year-old that wants to save until 65, and the assets are growing at a reasonable rate. So in both cases, they're following the same rate of return. But because we're able to put more money in the pension plan than under the RSP, we're going to end up with more money at the end of the projection period. So you can see here in this example that even over a fairly short savings horizon or period, there's a significant gap in value in favor of the pension plan that starts to develop over time. The question that people, by this point in time, when they listen to this presentation, some people get mad and they say, why is it that I didn't know about this? Why is it that everybody's pushing RRSPs? Why is RRSP the only thing I'm hearing about? Nobody's talking about pension plans. And, this doesn't seem fair. Well, it's not a question of fairness. It's a question of legislation. If you want to find out what governs an RSP, you look to Section 146 of the Income Tax Act. And this is where you find the single annual 18% contribution. If you want all of the other deductions and contributions that we've been talking about tonight, then you have to look for Section 147.1 of the Income Tax Act. And this is where you find the past service, special payments, terminal funding, fee deductibility, all that good stuff is part and parcel of those rules. So again, it's my old analogy of using the right tool. If you're trying to maximize your tax deductions, you have to use the right tool. And in this case, that's the registered pension plan. It's not the RRSP. Good news is that CPPP is available in all provinces and territories. And the plan is approved and regulated by the federal government of Canada. And depending on the province or territory that you're located in, it may also need to be registered with that government. But in most provinces, it's only the federal government that regulates the plan. In terms of pricing, remember what I said about the fees disappearing after 3 years if you have over $500,000 in assets. But if you don't, good news is that there are no setup fees. We waive those. Normally, when you set up a pension plan, most actuarial providers will charge an upfront fee because there's so much work involved, but we waive those. And then what happens is the annual fee of $2,800 for a PPP shrinks as time passes. So assuming you have at least $500,000 in the plan, including transfers of RSPs, by the end of the first year, there's a 25% refund. So the real cost, instead of being $2,800, drops to $2,373. In the second year, it drops again, third year, and then eventually it's free. So that's for those who have at least 500,000. If you don't, it's 2,800. For IPP, which is sort of the cheaper model, not as robust as a PPP, but still has a lot of advantages. An IPP, the annual fee instead of being 2,800 is 1,950. So we have the two models available. And we're almost coming to the end of the presentation, but it's important to realize that this federation is actually a dense network of best in class financial partners that keep the system going. So, what we've done is we partnered with some very strong financial institutions like Design Securities, that's a big D there, which has billions of dollars of assets under management. CI Financial, which is, I think, the largest Canadian mutual fund company in the world, in Canada, sorry, not in the world. Manulife for the insurance is, I think, the largest life insurance company in Canada. Aviso is the custodian, so that's the financial institution that has all the assets. Integris is the plan administrator firm. That's the firm that I'm the CEO of. So we have really tried to bring together sort of the leaders in different areas under one roof to create what I call institutional stability. Now, in terms of getting started, what I always recommend is get a complementary illustration done to find out, how much you can contribute for your past income if you've received salaries from your corporation, what your future contributions will be from now for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And then what does that give you in terms of a fixed pension at different retirement dates? Because that helps with planning and you can kind of put that in your financial plan. What about adding spouses and children to the plan for those who can legitimately put children on the payroll? Remember what I said about the intergenerational wealth transfer, right? And there's a lot more, but we can only talk about a few of the elements of these illustrations tonight. But that's really the best way to start the conversation, is to get a bespoke, tailored illustration that fits your particular facts so that it's no longer a theoretical conversation, it becomes very practical. And then you can quantify what you're missing out on by not doing this. In order to get that illustration, usually the easiest thing is to visit the website of the pension plan, and you can request a callback if you have general questions. You may not want to share illustration right away. You may want to ask some just basic questions first. That's fine. And then you can also request a meeting to discuss your illustration and say, I got my numbers. Can you walk me through all of these tables? Because it's a bit overwhelming, or I'm not used to reading this kind of material. So can you walk me through sort of the story and the logic behind setting up the pension plan? So that's it for the formal portion of the presentation. So I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Tran and field any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, JP, for taking us through that presentation and explanation. There's definitely a lot of information there and a lot of new information. So definitely people may have lots of questions. If you do have questions, again, you can either email me. You have my email, and we're happy to reply. We're also happy to jump on a Zoom call and chat with you with all the questions that you may have. Alternatively, you can also come to our office in Etobicoke, and we can meet and chat there as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording so that we can actually come on camera and also